The universe presents itself as coherent. Laws obeyed, causes preceding effects, matter persisting from one moment to the next. This appearance is persuasive, but persuasion is not proof. Beneath the equations that describe reality, cracks begin to form. Observation alters outcomes. Time behaves differently depending on how it is measured. Space itself expands without reason or destination. The deeper physics looks, the less solid existence becomes. What is taken for stability may be a temporary alignment. What is assumed to be fundamental may be emergent, simulated, or misinterpreted. Even the concept of an external world, independent of measurement, has begun to erode under experimental pressure. Reality does not simply exist. It negotiates, withholds, and occasionally contradicts itself. If the universe is deceptive, it is not through malice, but through indifference. There may be no underlying guarantee that what appears consistent will remain so. Meaning, causality and continuity could be local illusions, useful, fragile, and ultimately expendable. For most of human history, the universe has felt dependable. The sky returns to itself each morning. Objects fall when released, causes appear to produce effects with reassuring regularity. This reliability is not merely practical, it is psychological. Stability allows memory to function, planning to exist, and identity to persist. Without it, thought itself would fracture. The assumption that the universe follows consistent rules is not an abstract belief. It is the foundation upon which perception quietly rests. Yet this comfort did not emerge because the universe promised it. It emerged because organisms that assumed regularity survived long enough to reproduce. Patterns were favored. Predictability was rewarded. Over time, the mind learned to expect coherence, and expectation hardened into conviction. What feels like an external truth may instead be an internal necessity. The laws of nature, as they are commonly understood, are not laws in the sense of commands. They do not enforce behavior. They describe observed regularities, frozen into language after the fact. They are summaries of what has happened often enough to feel permanent. The danger lies in forgetting this distinction. Description quietly becomes prescription. Repetition becomes inevitability. When consistency holds for long enough, it begins to feel intrinsic. The universe seems obligated to continue behaving as it has before. This assumption is rarely spoken, but it is everywhere implied. Civilizations are built on it. Technology depends on it. Even skepticism relies on it. Doubt itself assumes that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough for doubt to matter. But consistency is not the same as necessity. A pattern that is held for billions of moments may still be contingent. The universe does not provide documentation for its future behavior. It offers only memory, and memory is not evidence of permanence. The comfort of apparent laws may be nothing more than the comfort of familiarity. At large scales, reality behaves politely. Structures persist, changes are gradual, violence is diluted across distance and time. This gentleness encourages trust. It suggests that the universe is well behaved, perhaps even neutral. But this impression depends heavily on distance. At smaller scales, the story becomes less courteous. Events refuse to follow intuition, outcomes depend on context. Observation itself becomes entangled with what is observed. This is not chaos in the dramatic sense. It is something colder, a kind of conditional behavior that only appears stable when averaged, blurred, or ignored. What looks like law may be the result of constant negotiation rather than fixed structure. Stability could be the surface tension of deeper uncertainty. The human mind struggles with this possibility because it undermines explanation. If laws are emergent rather than fundamental, then understanding becomes provisional. Knowledge becomes local. What is true here may not be true elsewhere. What holds now may not hold later. The universe ceases to be a machine and begins to resemble a process, one without guarantees. There is also a subtler discomfort. If the laws are not fundamental, then they do not protect meaning. Purpose often hides behind structure. Order feels like intent, even when none is claimed. Remove the permanence of laws, and the universe loses its implied reliability. Not just physically, but philosophically. If the rules themselves are temporary, then nothing beneath them can be secure. The idea that reality might shift its behavior is not new. Ancient thinkers suspected it. Mystics described worlds that flickered between states. What is new is the modern tendency to dismiss these intuitions as primitive. Scientific success bred confidence. Precision created the illusion of finality. The more accurately patterns were described, the more eternal they seemed. But precision does not imply completeness. A map can be detailed and still incomplete. A model can predict and still misunderstand. The danger lies not in using laws, but in trusting them too deeply, believing they are the universe rather than approximations of its habits. There is an unspoken belief that beneath complexity lies simplicity, that if one digs deep enough, the universe will resolve into something clean and final, a single framework, a final explanation. This belief is emotionally appealing. It suggests closure. It promises an end to uncertainty. But there is no evidence that reality shares this preference. Instead, the deeper inquiry goes, the more conditional things become. Explanations rely on context. Assumptions stack upon assumptions. What once felt solid dissolves into layers of dependence. The universe does not reveal a foundation so much as a recursion. The comfort of apparent laws also serves a social function. Shared reality requires shared expectations. Agreement about how the world behaves allows coordination, trust, and collective action. Questioning the permanence of laws is not just intellectually unsettling, it is socially destabilizing. It threatens the background agreement that makes communication possible. For this reason, uncertainty is often framed as ignorance rather than as a feature of reality. It is safer to believe that unanswered questions are temporary gaps in knowledge than to accept that the universe itself may be incomplete, inconsistent, or context-bound. Ignorance can be cured. Indeterminacy cannot. Yet there are moments when the universe behaves in ways that feel less like ignorance and more like refusal, when outcomes cannot be separated from conditions of observation, when predictions work statistically but fail individually, when explanation becomes circular. These moments suggest that the stability we rely on may be an emergent illusion, a macroscopic agreement arising from microscopic ambiguity. If that is the case, then the laws of nature are not guardians of order, but artifacts of scale. They hold because averaging hides deviation. They comfort because distance softens contradiction. Up close, reality may be far less committed to coherence than we assume. This realization does not make the universe hostile in a conventional sense. It makes it indifferent to expectation. The danger is not that the laws will suddenly break, but that they were never absolute to begin with, that their authority exists only where conditions allow it. The most unsettling possibility is not that reality is chaotic, but that it is selectively stable, that it behaves reliably only where reliability is observed, needed, or enforced by context. Stability then becomes relational rather than intrinsic. The universe does not guarantee order, it merely permits it under certain circumstances. The comfort of apparent laws is powerful precisely because it works so well. It allows life, thought, and memory to function. But comfort should not be confused with truth. Familiarity is not evidence. Regularity is not permanence. The universe has never promised consistency. It has only repeated itself long enough for repetition to feel like law. There is a quiet assumption embedded in everyday experience that the world exists independently of attention. Objects remain where they are whether they are watched or not. Events unfold regardless of awareness. Observation, in this view, is passive. It is a window, not a force. The mind looks outward, and reality continues unaffected. This assumption feels obvious because it is necessary. If observation altered the world in any meaningful way, perception would become dangerous. Looking would no longer be neutral. Knowing would carry consequences beyond understanding. For most of human history, this danger remained hidden behind scale and limitation. The universe appeared large enough, stable enough to absorb attention without reacting. But closer inspection erodes this comfort. At fundamental levels, the act of observing is no longer separable from the thing observed. Information is not simply received, it is extracted. Interaction becomes unavoidable. To know is to disturb. To measure is to interfere. Reality does not sit still while it is being examined. This is not a flaw in tools or a limitation of technique. It appears to be structural. Observation requires interaction, and interaction alters conditions. There is no position outside the system from which it can be viewed cleanly. Every attempt to isolate truth introduces context. Every attempt to remove influence leaves a trace. The unsettling implication is that reality may not have a single, observer-independent state. Instead, it may exist as a range of potential conditions that only resolve when interaction forces a commitment. The world does not simply reveal itself, it responds. And the response depends on how the question is asked. This challenges a deeply held image of truth. Truth is often imagined as something fixed, waiting to be uncovered, a hidden object beneath layers of ignorance. But if observation shapes outcome, then truth becomes relational. What is revealed depends on the manner of inquiry. There may be no answer that exists independently of the question. This does not mean reality is subjective in a comforting sense. It does not bend to desire or belief. It is far more indifferent than that. The intrusion of observation does not grant control, it introduces limitation. Certain questions exclude certain answers. Certain measurements prevent others from being made. Knowledge gains clarity in one dimension only by sacrificing it in another. The universe, in this light, does not offer a complete picture. It offers fragments, each conditioned by the act of looking. The more precisely one aspect is examined, the more others dissolve into uncertainty. Completeness becomes inaccessible not because of ignorance, but because of structure. There is something deeply unsettling about this arrangement. It suggests that reality resists total comprehension not by being hidden, but by being participatory. The observer is not an external witness, but an internal disturbance. The act of knowing is woven into the fabric of what is known. This undermines the idea of a neutral perspective. There is no view from nowhere. Every frame of reference is embedded, situated, compromised. Even attempts to minimize intrusion rely on assumptions about what counts as minimal. The choice itself is an intrusion. At larger scales, this entanglement fades into invisibility. The world appears stable because the effects of observation are diluted. Countless interactions average out. Individual disturbances disappear into noise. This creates the illusion that observation is harmless. But the illusion depends on scale, not principle. The danger is assuming that what is true at one scale must be true at all scales. This assumption has failed repeatedly. The deeper inquiry goes, the more the universe refuses to behave like an object under inspection. It behaves instead like a process that reacts to being engaged. There is also a philosophical consequence that is harder to confront. If observation is intrusive, then knowledge is not a mirror, but an intervention. Understanding is not passive reflection, but active participation. This blurs the line between discovery and creation, not in the sense of inventing reality, but in the sense of shaping which version of reality becomes actual. This does not imply intention. The universe does not care that it is being observed, but it responds nonetheless. Indifference does not prevent interaction, it merely removes purpose from it. The unsettling thought is that there may be no final account of reality that excludes the observer. Any description that claims to do so may be incomplete by definition. The observer cannot be subtracted without altering the system. The attempt to remove influence becomes just another form of influence. This creates a recursive problem. To understand reality, one must observe it. But observation changes what is being understood. The more carefully this is accounted for, the more complex the description becomes. Eventually, explanation begins to fold back on itself. There is no clean exit from this loop. One cannot step outside the universe to view it objectively. There is no external reference point from which intrusion disappears. All perspectives are internal. All knowledge is situated. The universe is closed under observation. This closure destabilizes certainty. It suggests that some aspects of reality may be inherently inaccessible, not hidden behind complexity, but inaccessible because access itself alters them. The limit is not technological, it is conceptual. What remains is a picture of a universe that does not tolerate passive scrutiny. It does not present itself fully to be catalogued. It reacts, adjusts, and constrains, not out of hostility, but out of structure. When observation becomes intrusion, reality stops being a static thing and becomes an event, a negotiation between what is possible and what is asked. The universe does not lie, but it does not reveal itself without cost. The unsettling conclusion is not that the universe deceives, but that it never agreed to be transparent. Understanding is not a right, it is an interaction, and every interaction leaves a mark. There is an expectation, rarely questioned, that reality eventually resolves. That beneath uncertainty lies a definite state. That ambiguity is temporary, a symptom of incomplete information rather than a feature of existence itself. This expectation comforts, because it promises closure. It suggests that confusion is not fundamental, only provisional. That if one waits long enough or looks carefully enough, things will settle into clarity. But what if they never do? At deeper levels of inquiry, reality appears less like a fixed structure and more like a field of possibilities that resist final commitment, not because of chaos, but because of persistence. States linger without collapsing into singular outcomes. Conditions remain open-ended. What seems undecided is not rushing toward resolution. It is maintaining tension. This refusal to settle challenges the intuition that the universe prefers definiteness. Instead, it hints at a reality that tolerates ambiguity indefinitely. A reality where indeterminacy is not a flaw to be corrected, but a condition to be maintained. The mind struggles with this because cognition is built on resolution. Decisions, distinctions, boundaries. These are the tools thought uses to function. To think is to separate. To understand is to reduce. A reality that resists settling undermines the very mechanisms used to grasp it. At human scales, this resistance is easy to ignore. Objects appear stable. Identities persist. Events seem to conclude cleanly. But this stability is conditional. It emerges from repetition, reinforcement, and scale. Beneath it, unresolved states coexist, influencing outcomes without ever fully disappearing. What appears settled may only be temporarily constrained. What appears definite may be the result of constant pressure rather than inherent clarity. Reality holds together not because it is finished, but because it is continuously negotiated. This has unsettling implications for the concept of truth. Truth is often imagined as correspondence, a statement matching a settled state of affairs. But if states themselves remain unsettled, then truth becomes less about correspondence and more about consistency within context. What is true is what holds long enough, not what resolves absolutely. This does not imply relativism in the comforting sense. It does not mean anything can be true. It means truth may be conditional, local, and fragile, dependent on boundaries that are themselves provisional. The refusal of reality to settle also disrupts the idea of final explanations. There is a persistent hope that deeper understanding will simplify the world. That complexity is a surface phenomenon, masking an underlying simplicity. But the deeper inquiry goes, the more layered reality becomes. Explanations generate further questions. Foundations reveal dependencies. Closure recedes. Instead of convergence, there is recursion. Instead of finality, there is deferral. Reality explains itself only by referring to itself, and the loop never fully closes. This unsettles the notion of progress in understanding. Knowledge accumulates, but certainty does not. Precision increases, but finality does not follow. The universe becomes more detailed, not more resolved. Each advance sharpens the outline of uncertainty rather than erasing it. There is also a temporal discomfort embedded here. If reality never settles, then the present is not a completed moment, but an ongoing process. The now is not a point, but a span of unresolved conditions. The past influences the present not as a fixed record, but as a set of constraints still exerting pressure. The future is not waiting. It is already participating through possibility. This blurring of temporal boundaries erodes the sense of linear progression. Events do not simply happen and conclude. They overlap, interfere, and remain partially open. Resolution becomes an approximation, not a fact. The mind resists this because it destabilizes identity. If reality is unsettled, then so is the self. Identity relies on continuity. Memory assumes stability. But if the world itself is in flux at a fundamental level, then persistence becomes a pattern rather than a guarantee. The self holds together not because it is fixed, but because it is repeatedly reinforced. This does not mean the self is illusory in a trivial sense. It means it is contingent, maintained by conditions that could, in principle, shift. The same is true of everything else that appears solid. There is an unspoken belief that instability must lead to collapse, that if things are not settled, they must be falling apart. But this is a projection. Instability can be sustained. Ambiguity can persist without resolving into chaos. Reality may be structured precisely to avoid final collapse by never allowing complete settlement. In this view, definiteness is dangerous. Total resolution would lock the universe into a single state, eliminating flexibility. Unsettledness preserves adaptability. It allows variation, emergence, and novelty. The cost is uncertainty. The benefit is continuity. This reframes the universe not as a finished product, but as an ongoing negotiation, not moving toward an end, but maintaining a balance between constraint and possibility. The refusal to settle is not a failure of structure, but a feature of it. Yet this feature is unsettling, because it removes guarantees. If reality never fully commits, then nothing is absolutely secure. Stability becomes a condition, not a promise. Patterns hold because conditions support them, not because they must. The human response to this is often to impose artificial closure. Narratives are constructed. Boundaries are drawn. Categories are enforced. These tools are necessary for survival, but they can be mistaken for truth. The danger lies in confusing cognitive convenience with ontological certainty. Reality does not owe clarity to understanding. It does not need to resolve to be functional. It only needs to persist. And persistence does not require final answers. The refusal to settle also undermines the hope of ultimate meaning. Meaning is often tied to resolution. Endings give purpose to beginnings. Conclusions justify processes. If reality never concludes, then meaning cannot be anchored in final states. It must emerge locally, temporarily, and without guarantee. This is not nihilism. It is something colder. Meaning exists, but it does not accumulate toward an endpoint. It flickers, context-bound, sustained only as long as conditions allow. There is no cosmic archive preserving it. What makes this terrifying is not fear of destruction, but the absence of completion. The universe does not rush toward clarity. It lingers in tension. It permits structure without finality, order without closure. Reality refuses to settle not because it is broken, but because settlement may be incompatible with existence itself. To fully resolve would be to stop. To remain unsettled is to continue. The unsettling realization is that uncertainty may not be a temporary phase in the pursuit of understanding. It may be the permanent background against which all understanding occurs. The universe is not waiting to be finished. It is sustaining itself through perpetual incompleteness. And in that incompleteness, everything that feels solid is quietly provisional. There is a deep assumption woven into thought itself, that events follow one another in a reliable order, that something happens, and then something else happens because of it. This sequence feels so fundamental that it becomes invisible. Cause produces effect. Action leads to consequence. The past gives rise to the present, which shapes the future. Without this structure, memory would lose meaning and intention would dissolve. Causality is not just a feature of the world, it is the scaffolding of understanding. Language depends on it, responsibility depends on it. Even identity depends on the belief that earlier states give rise to later ones in a continuous chain. To question this structure is not merely to question a scientific principle, but to destabilize coherence itself. And yet, the deeper reality is examined, the more fragile this chain appears. At everyday scales, cause and effect appear robust. Push an object and it moves. Make a choice and a result follows. These relationships feel solid because they are reinforced by repetition. The same patterns recur often enough to create trust. Over time, trust hardens into assumption. But repetition does not imply necessity. A sequence that holds under certain conditions may fail under others. Cause and effect may not be universal laws, but local habits, patterns that persist only where conditions allow them to. There are situations where outcomes do not map cleanly onto causes, where small changes produce disproportionate effects, where identical actions lead to different results, where consequences appear without clear origins, and origins dissolve into background noise. These are often dismissed as complexity or ignorance, but dismissal does not resolve the discomfort they introduce. The fragility lies not in the occasional breakdown of causality, but in its dependence on context. Cause and effect require separation, a before and an after, an initiator and a result. But if time itself is not a clean sequence, if events overlap rather than line up, then causality becomes ambiguous. What causes what when boundaries blur? There is also the problem of isolation. To identify a cause, one must isolate it from everything else. But nothing exists in isolation. Every event is embedded in a web of conditions, influences, and constraints. Choosing one factor as the cause is often a matter of convenience rather than truth. It reflects what is emphasized, not what is fundamental. This does not mean causes do not exist. It means they may not exist as singular, self-contained entities. What is called a cause may be a convergence. What is called an effect may be a redistribution. The clean arrow from one to the other may be an artifact of simplification. The discomfort deepens when considering that some events appear to resist causal explanation altogether, not because they are random in a trivial sense, but because their occurrence cannot be traced back to a single, definitive origin. They emerge from conditions without being dictated by them. The past constrains, but does not determine. This undermines the comforting belief that the future is contained within the past, that if one knew enough, prediction would become perfect. Instead, knowledge increases resolution without eliminating uncertainty. The more detailed the picture becomes, the more sensitive outcomes appear to subtle differences. Determinism fades not into chaos, but into conditionality. The fragility of cause and effect also destabilizes moral intuition. Responsibility relies on causation. Actions are judged based on their consequences. Intent is linked to outcome. But if outcomes are not strictly caused, if they arise from networks rather than chains, then responsibility becomes diffuse. Blame and credit lose their sharp edges. This is deeply unsettling because it threatens the coherence of agency. To act is to expect an effect. If effects are not guaranteed, action becomes probabilistic rather than decisive. Choice becomes influence rather than command. Yet this fragility does not eliminate agency. It reframes it. Action still matters, but not because it dictates outcomes. It matters because it alters conditions. It shifts probabilities. It participates in processes rather than controlling them. This reframing is uncomfortable because it removes certainty. It replaces control with contribution. The universe does not respond to actions with obedience, but with negotiation. There is also a temporal tension embedded in fragile causality. If effects do not follow causes cleanly, then the direction of influence becomes ambiguous. The past shapes the present, but the present also reshapes the meaning of the past. Memory is not a static record. It is continuously revised. Interpretation flows backward as well as forward. This creates the unsettling sense that causality is not a one-way street. That explanation is not fixed at the moment of occurrence, but evolves as context changes. What something was caused by may shift depending on later developments. The narrative of cause and effect becomes unstable. This instability does not imply deception. It implies that causality is a model, not a feature carved into reality. It is a way of organizing experience, not a guarantee provided by the universe. It works because it is useful, not because it is absolute. The danger lies in mistaking usefulness for fundamentality. When cause and effect are treated as inviolable, anomalies are forced into explanations that preserve the model rather than challenge it. Complexity is blamed, noise is invoked. The model is protected at the expense of accuracy. But when the model is allowed to fracture, something more unsettling appears. A universe where events are not chained, but entangled. Where influence is distributed rather than linear. Where outcomes emerge from relationships rather than instructions. In such a universe, prediction becomes limited not by ignorance alone, but by structure. The future is not hidden in the past, waiting to be uncovered. It is partially open, constrained but not specified. The past sets the stage, but the play is not fully written. This openness is often mistaken for freedom in a comforting sense. But it is not liberating. It is indifferent. The universe does not grant openness for the sake of choice. It simply does not close itself fully. The fragility of cause and effect also undermines the idea of ultimate explanation. If events do not have singular causes, then explanation becomes contextual rather than final. Answers depend on framing. Different questions yield different causal stories, none of which are complete. This does not make explanation meaningless. It makes it provisional. Explanations work within boundaries. They hold until conditions shift. There is no final account that captures all influence without remainder. The unsettling conclusion is that causality may be a surface phenomenon, a pattern that emerges where conditions are stable enough to support it. Beneath that surface, influence is diffuse, time is entangled, and outcomes are negotiated rather than dictated. The universe does not promise that effects will follow causes cleanly. It only allows patterns to persist long enough for them to be mistaken for laws. Cause and effect feel solid because they usually work. But their reliability is a condition, not a certainty. When that reliability weakens, it does not collapse into chaos. It reveals something colder, a reality that does not organize itself around human expectations of order. A reality where influence exists without obligation and outcomes occur without guarantees. The fragility of cause and effect is terrifying not because it introduces randomness, but because it removes assurance. The universe continues, but it does not explain itself in straight lines. It moves through webs, not chains. And in a world without guaranteed causality, certainty becomes a habit rather than a truth, one that can persist, but never fully justify itself. Time feels unavoidable. It moves forward without pause, carrying everything with it. Memories accumulate behind it, possibilities open ahead of it, and the present slips through unnoticed. This flow feels so fundamental that it is rarely questioned. Time appears to be the stage on which reality unfolds, constant and universal, the same everywhere and for everything. But this familiarity may be deceptive. The sense of time as a single shared river is not something the universe guarantees. It is something experience constructs. The feeling of before and after emerges from change, memory, and expectation. Without these, time loses its structure. It stops behaving like a direction and becomes something harder to define. What is unsettling is that time may not be a universal background at all. It may be local, conditional, dependent on processes rather than governing them. In everyday life, time appears uniform because the conditions that generate it are stable. Biological rhythms, environmental cycles, and cognitive processes align closely enough to create the illusion of a shared temporal order. Clocks agree because the systems that support them agree. This agreement is practical, not fundamental. Strip away these stabilizing conditions, and time begins to fracture. Different processes imply different tempos. Some changes accumulate slowly, others abruptly. Some sequences matter, others do not. The idea of a single, global timeline starts to feel imposed rather than discovered. This raises an unsettling possibility. Time may not exist everywhere in the same way. It may arise only where change is structured in a particular manner, where memory can form, where states can be compared. In regions or conditions where these requirements fail, time may lose meaning altogether. The mind resists this because identity depends on temporal continuity. The self is experienced as something that persists through time. Without a stable temporal framework, continuity dissolves. The question of what someone is becomes inseparable from when they are. If time is local, then identity is local as well, not anchored to a universal flow, but to specific processes that maintain coherence. The self exists not because time carries it forward, but because certain patterns repeat reliably enough to simulate persistence. This reframing destabilizes the notion of permanence. Things do not endure because time allows them to. They endure because conditions sustain them. Time is not the cause of change, it is a description of it. When change ceases or becomes incoherent, time fades with it. There is also a deeper discomfort here. If time is emergent rather than fundamental, then the universe does not unfold toward anything. There is no global direction, no universal progression. What feels like forward motion may be a local bias, not a cosmic rule. The idea of an arrow of time is often taken as evidence of directionality in reality, but direction may be an artifact of imbalance. Where processes dissipate, accumulate, or decay asymmetrically, direction appears. Where balance holds, direction vanishes. Time does not flow. It accumulates meaning only where change leaves traces. This suggests that the past is not something that exists independently. It exists insofar as records persist. Memory, structure, and residue give the impression of a fixed past. Without them, the past would be indistinguishable from nothing at all. The future, likewise, is not a destination waiting to arrive. It is a set of unresolved conditions. Possibilities constrained by context, not events cued in advance. The future does not come toward the present. It collapses into it as conditions shift. This collapses the comforting image of time as a container. There is no timeline holding events in order. There are only relations between states. Sequence emerges where relations are strong enough to enforce it. The unsettling consequence is that simultaneity becomes ambiguous. What is now in one context may not align with now in another. Without a universal clock, the present fractures into local presence. Each process carries its own sense of immediacy. This does not mean chaos, it means plurality. Many temporal frameworks coexisting without a single authority. Time becomes a patchwork rather than a line. The human experience of time masks this complexity because it is optimized for coherence. Consciousness stitches moments together into a narrative. Gaps are smoothed. Irregularities are ignored. The result is a seamless sense of flow that feels fundamental precisely because it is constructed so efficiently. But efficiency is not truth. The deeper implication is that time may be a tool rather than a property, a way systems organize change, not a substance through which they move. Where the tool is useful, it appears real. Where it fails, it disappears. This raises disturbing questions about beginnings and endings. If time is local, then the idea of a universal origin loses clarity. An absolute beginning assumes a global temporal framework. Without one, origins become contextual. Something can begin relative to one process while being continuous relative to another. Endings, too, lose finality. An event may end within one framework and persist within another. There is no single moment where something stops existing everywhere at once. Termination becomes relative, not absolute. This erodes the idea of a final state of the universe. If time does not govern everything uniformly, then there may be no ultimate future toward which all processes converge. No final equilibrium, only regions settling, dissolving, or transforming independently. The psychological impact of this is profound. Meaning is often tied to temporal arcs. Stories begin, progress, and conclude. Purpose is found in trajectories. If time itself is fragmented, then meaning cannot rely on universal narratives. It must exist locally, without cosmic endorsement. This is not comforting. Local meaning is fragile. It depends on conditions that can fail. There is no guarantee that significance accumulates or persists beyond its context. The most unsettling aspect is that time's apparent authority may be an illusion born of scale. At scales where patterns repeat reliably, time feels solid. Where repetition breaks down, time dissolves. The universe does not enforce time, it tolerates it where conditions allow. This reframes change itself. Change is not something that happens in time. Time is something inferred from change. Remove structured change, and time has nothing to anchor it. The idea that time might be an anomaly rather than a foundation undermines nearly every intuitive model of reality. It suggests that existence is not arranged along a single axis of progression, but scattered across interacting processes, each with its own rhythm. There is no master clock counting down existence, no universal present sweeping forward. Only local patterns, sustaining their own sense of before and after for as long as they can. This is terrifying, not because it suggests instability, but because it removes narrative. The universe is not going anywhere. It is not moving toward resolution or collapse in any global sense. It is simply sustaining processes until they fail. Time, then, is not the story of the universe. It is a side effect of how parts of it behave under certain conditions. What feels eternal may be temporary. What feels fundamental may be situational. And what feels inevitable may be nothing more than a habit, repeated long enough to feel unavoidable. If time is a local anomaly, then the universe is not unfolding. It is persisting without direction. And the sense of flow that feels so inescapable may be nothing more than the way consciousness copes with change in a reality that offers no global order. In that case, the most disturbing possibility is not that time will end, but that it was never truly there to begin with, only assembled, moment by moment, wherever stability briefly allows it. There is a deeply ingrained assumption behind almost every attempt to understand reality, that it can, in principle, be viewed from the outside. That even if no one can actually step beyond the universe, it still makes sense to imagine how things are in themselves, independent of perspective. This imagined external view acts as a silent reference point. It is where objectivity is supposed to live. But this view may not exist. Every description of reality is produced from within reality. Every framework, every measurement, every concept is embedded in the very thing it tries to describe. There is no external vantage point from which the universe can be observed as a whole, no neutral ground beyond it. The idea of such a perspective is a cognitive projection, not an available position. This is unsettling because objectivity depends on distance. To be objective is to be detached, to observe without being involved. But detachment requires separation, and separation requires an outside. If there is no outside, then there is no pure detachment, only degrees of involvement. The universe, in this sense, is self-contained, not just physically, but conceptually. Any attempt to describe it is an internal event. Any claim about its total nature is made from within its constraints. The observer and the observed are not just interacting. They are inseparable at the most basic level. This undermines the classical image of knowledge as a mirror. Knowledge does not reflect an external reality. It reorganizes internal experience. Understanding is not a copy of the world, but a pattern formed inside it. The universe does not present itself for inspection. It contains the inspection as part of itself. The absence of an external view introduces a profound limitation. There may be aspects of reality that cannot be described without contradiction, because any description presupposes the very structure it is trying to explain. Attempts to account for the whole inevitably rely on parts of the whole. Explanation becomes circular, not by accident, but by necessity. This circularity is often treated as a temporary failure, a sign that better tools or deeper insight will eventually break the loop. But there is no reason to believe the loop can be broken. The universe may be fundamentally self-referential. Any account of it may have to include itself as part of what it describes. This creates a strange epistemic tension. On the one hand, understanding progresses. Models improve. Predictions sharpen. On the other hand, the ultimate frame remains unreachable. The more one understands, the clearer it becomes that the understanding is situated. There is always an implicit "from here" attached to every statement. The idea of a universe without an external view also destabilizes the concept of totality. What does it mean to talk about everything if there is no standpoint from which everything can be surveyed? Totality becomes an abstraction, not a thing. It exists in language, not in experience. This matters because many comforting ideas depend on totality. Final explanations, ultimate laws, complete descriptions. These ideas assume that reality can be gathered into a single coherent picture. But coherence itself may be local. What holds together from one perspective may fragment from another. Without an external view, there is no privileged perspective to arbitrate between them. This does not imply that all perspectives are equal. Some are more stable, more predictive, more useful than others. But usefulness is not the same as truth in an absolute sense. It is alignment with specific conditions, not correspondence with an external standard. The universe, without an external view, is not unknowable, but it is unfinishable. Knowledge accumulates, but it does not converge on a final picture. There is always another context in which current understanding becomes partial. Completion is indefinitely deferred. This deferral is deeply unsettling because it removes the possibility of closure. There is no final answer waiting beyond the next discovery, no ultimate vantage point from which everything snaps into place. The universe does not resolve into simplicity when fully understood. It reveals deeper entanglement. There is also a metaphysical discomfort here. If there is no external view, then the distinction between appearance and reality becomes unstable. Appearance is usually contrasted with how things really are. But really are implies an external reference. Without it, appearance is not a distortion of reality. It is the only access to it. This does not mean appearances are arbitrary. They are constrained, structured, and consistent within limits. But they are not shadows cast by a hidden, fully formed reality. They are manifestations produced within specific conditions. There is no backstage where the universe exists in its true form. The mind resists this because it wants reassurance that there is something solid behind experience, something that exists regardless of interpretation, something that guarantees coherence. The idea that reality might not have an observer-independent face feels like a betrayal of intuition. Yet intuition evolved for survival, not for metaphysical accuracy. It favors stable narratives over unsettling structures. The need for an external view may be psychological rather than ontological. There is also a theological echo here. Many conceptions of divinity function as an external view, a perspective outside the universe that sees it whole. Removing this perspective does not just alter metaphysics, it alters existential orientation. There is no cosmic witness, no ultimate standpoint that validates existence from beyond. The universe observes itself only through its own processes. Awareness, where it arises, is internal. There is no external audience. This makes existence feel exposed. There is nothing outside the universe to ground it, judge it, or complete it. It exists without endorsement. It persists without explanation beyond itself. The absence of an external view also affects the notion of reality being about something. Aboutness implies reference beyond. Meaning often assumes an external anchor. Without one, meaning becomes internal and contextual. It exists within systems, not beyond them. This does not annihilate meaning, but it strips it of cosmic backing. Meaning works locally, or it does not work at all. There is no universal meaning imposed from outside the system. Only patterns that sustain significance under certain conditions. The most disturbing aspect of a universe without an external view is not that it is unknowable, but that it is alone, completely self-contained. There is nothing beyond it to appeal to, no higher level to explain it. It does not point outward, it folds inward. In such a universe, explanation never escapes the system. It rearranges internal relations, but never transcends them. Every answer is another configuration of the same material. This is not a flaw. It may be the only way existence can be. But it removes the final refuge of objectivity. There is no place to stand where reality becomes fully transparent. The universe does not hide its true nature behind a veil. There is no veil. There is only participation. To exist is to be inside, and to understand is to work with partial views that never add up to a complete whole. This is not deception in the sense of lying. It is deception only if one expects an external guarantee that was never possible. The universe is not withholding its true form. It simply does not have one that exists independently of perspective. What remains is a reality that cannot be fully stepped back from. A reality that includes every attempt to understand it as part of itself. A reality that cannot be framed from the outside because there is no outside to occupy. And in that closure, certainty quietly dissolves. Not because the universe is chaotic, but because it is complete enough not to need an external witness. The most unsettling realization is that objectivity may not be the discovery of an external truth, but the management of internal consistency within a system that has no vantage point beyond itself. The universe does not allow itself to be seen whole. Not because it is hiding, but because there is nowhere to stand where whole makes sense. For centuries, the pursuit of understanding reality has been guided by a single ambition: to describe the universe as it truly is, independent of perception, interpretation, or context. Objectivity was the ideal, a view stripped of bias, position, and participation. The hope was that beneath human limitation lay a clean, impersonal structure waiting to be revealed. But that ambition may have been misplaced. As inquiry deepened, it became increasingly difficult to separate description from involvement. The tools used to understand reality proved inseparable from the conditions being described. Assumptions once treated as neutral revealed themselves as structural. Frameworks did not merely describe reality, they shaped what could be said about it. This marked a quiet but radical shift. Understanding no longer progressed toward a single detached picture. Instead, it fractured into contextual accounts, each valid within its limits, none able to claim final authority. Objectivity did not disappear, but it changed character. It became conditional rather than absolute. Physics after objectivity is not the abandonment of rigor. It is the recognition that rigor does not require detachment from context. Precision can exist without claiming universality. Models can be exact without being complete. This is deeply unsettling because it removes the notion of a final description. If every account is situated, then no theory stands outside perspective. There is no ultimate framework that subsumes all others without remainder. Understanding becomes plural, layered, and incomplete by design. The discomfort lies in what this implies about truth. Truth was once imagined as correspondence with an observer-independent reality. After objectivity, truth becomes alignment within constraints. A statement is true insofar as it holds across contexts that share certain conditions. Outside those conditions, it may dissolve. This is not relativism in the casual sense. It does not suggest that all descriptions are equally valid. Some are more stable, more predictive, more coherent. But stability is not the same as finality. Coherence does not imply completeness. The universe, in this view, does not submit to a single language. It tolerates many, each carving out a region of intelligibility. Where one language fails, another may succeed, not because reality has changed, but because the mode of engagement has. This undermines the idea that there is a privileged description waiting to be found. There may be no ultimate translation that renders all perspectives into one. The hope for unification gives way to the reality of coexistence. Physics, after objectivity, accepts that description is intervention, that choosing a framework highlights some features while suppressing others. Every act of understanding is selective. Nothing is revealed without something else being obscured. This selectivity was once treated as a temporary limitation, a problem to be solved by better theories. Now it appears structural. There may be no description that does not leave something out, because leaving something out is what description does. The unsettling consequence is that reality cannot be fully captured. It can be approached, constrained, and navigated, but not exhausted. The universe resists total representation, not by hiding, but by exceeding any single mode of articulation. This changes the role of explanation. Explanation is no longer the uncovering of a final mechanism. It is the construction of a workable account within defined boundaries. Success is measured by coherence and applicability, not by claims of ultimate truth. There is a quiet loss embedded in this shift. The dream of standing outside reality, of seeing it whole, dissolves. There is no final vantage point from which the universe becomes transparent. Every view is partial, and every synthesis introduces new blind spots. This loss is often resisted. There is a tendency to treat post-objective perspectives as incomplete, immature, or provisional, as if the return to absolute objectivity were only a matter of time. But this resistance may be denial. The structure of reality itself may preclude such a return. The universe may not be built to be fully described from a single standpoint. It may not have a preferred language. It may not care about coherence beyond what conditions enforce locally. Physics after objectivity also destabilizes the boundary between observer and system. The observer is no longer an external reader of reality, but a participant whose presence shapes the domain of description. This does not grant creative power, but it removes the illusion of separation. Understanding becomes an internal process. Reality explains itself from within, using tools that are themselves part of what is being explained. This creates a recursive structure that never closes. Every explanation relies on assumptions that cannot be fully justified without invoking the same system again. This recursion is not a flaw. It is a feature of self-contained systems. The universe cannot step outside itself to validate its own description. It can only generate internal consistencies that persist under certain conditions. The unsettling implication is that certainty becomes unattainable in principle, not just in practice. There is no final confirmation waiting at the end of inquiry, only increasingly refined structures that work until they don't. This does not halt progress. It changes its meaning. Progress becomes the expansion of applicability, not the approach to final truth. The goal is not completion, but resilience across contexts. There is also an existential consequence. If objectivity is conditional, then the authority of explanation weakens. Knowledge loses its claim to inevitability. It becomes persuasive rather than definitive. This opens space for doubt, not as ignorance, but as a permanent companion to understanding. The universe, in this frame, does not demand belief in any single account. It allows multiple accounts to coexist, each carving out a region of stability. Conflict between accounts is not necessarily a sign of error. It may reflect the limits of translation between contexts. This reframes disagreement. Instead of competing for dominance, frameworks may be incommensurable, each accurate within its domain, none reducible to the others without loss. Unity becomes an aspiration, not a guarantee. Physics after objectivity is unsettling because it removes the comfort of final answers. It replaces the idea of a universe that can be fully known with one that can only be partially engaged. Knowledge becomes a practice, not a possession. There is no final theory that ends inquiry, no last word that silences uncertainty. The universe does not conclude, it persists. This persistence without closure can feel hostile. It denies the satisfaction of completion. It forces understanding to remain provisional, adaptable, and incomplete. But this hostility is not intentional. It is structural. The universe does not offer itself as an object to be mastered. It offers itself as a process to be navigated. Objectivity was an attempt to freeze this process into a static picture. After objectivity, the picture dissolves back into motion. What remains is not chaos, but humility. Not because humility is virtuous, but because it is unavoidable. Any claim to total understanding collapses under its own weight. The universe is larger than any description made from within it. The most unsettling realization is not that reality is unknowable, but that it does not care to be fully known. It does not resist explanation. It simply exceeds it. Physics, after objectivity, does not end the search for understanding. It removes the illusion that the search has a final destination. The universe does not yield a definitive account of itself. It allows only temporary alignments between description and behavior. And when those alignments fail, understanding does not collapse into ignorance. It reconfigures, adapting to new conditions, leaving behind the hope that certainty was ever possible. In a universe without absolute objectivity, knowledge survives not by claiming truth, but by remaining flexible. The collapse is not of science, but of the expectation that reality was ever obligated to make complete sense from a single point of view. What remains is a world that can be engaged, but never finished. A universe that allows understanding, but never completion. And in that open-endedness, certainty quietly disappears. Not as a catastrophe, but as a condition that was never truly available to begin with. There is a growing suspicion that matter is not the foundation it once appeared to be. That beneath solidity, beneath energy and structure, something more abstract persists. Not a thing in the traditional sense, but a pattern, a record, a difference that makes a difference. Information begins to appear not as a description of reality, but as its raw material. This idea is unsettling because information feels secondary. It sounds like something extracted from the world, not something that constitutes it. Data implies a sender. A message implies intention. Yet here, information exists without meaning, without purpose, without audience. It does not signify. It simply persists. What makes this disturbing is that information does not require substance in the familiar sense. It requires distinction. A state that is not another state. A boundary that separates possibilities. Where such distinctions exist, information exists. And where information exists, structure follows. This reverses intuition. Instead of matter carrying information, information appears to give rise to matter-like behavior. Stability emerges not from solidity, but from constraint. Persistence arises not from substance, but from repeated patterns that resist erasure. In this view, reality is not built from things, but from differences that endure. Objects are not fundamental. They are stabilized configurations of informational patterns. What appears solid is simply what changes slowly relative to its surroundings. This reframing strips the universe of familiarity. There is no underlying stuff, no primordial substance waiting beneath appearances. There are only relations, encoded constraints, and the persistence of form. Existence becomes closer to computation than construction, though even that analogy fails under scrutiny. Information, unlike matter, does not care about scale. It is indifferent to size, location, and embodiment. The same pattern can exist in radically different forms. What matters is not what carries the information, but that it is carried at all. The carrier is replaceable. The pattern is not. This creates a chilling implication. The universe may be fundamentally substrate independent. The same informational structures could, in principle, manifest through different physical arrangements without losing their identity. Reality becomes portable, not in space, but in structure. What we call laws may then be constraints on information flow rather than commands imposed on matter. Regularity arises not because the universe is rigid, but because certain patterns are easier to preserve than others. Stability is a selection effect, not a guarantee. This perspective destabilizes the notion of permanence. If reality is informational, then persistence depends on error correction, redundancy, and constraint. When these fail, patterns dissolve. There is no underlying substance to fall back on. Loss is final. Erasure is real. This is not comforting. Substance implies endurance. Information implies fragility. Patterns must be maintained. Without support, they decay. The universe does not preserve structure out of obligation. It preserves what can survive under existing conditions. The unsettling thought is that existence itself may be conditional on informational stability. Things exist not because they are, but because they manage to continue. Being is not a state. It is an ongoing achievement. This reframes destruction. Destruction is not the breaking of matter, but the loss of pattern. When information is scrambled beyond recovery, the thing ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. There is no residue of essence left behind, only noise. This also reframes creation. Creation is not the introduction of substance, but the emergence of new patterns. Novel distinctions arise, stabilize, and persist long enough to be noticed. Creativity is not additive, it is configurational. Meaning, in this framework, becomes precarious. Meaning is a pattern layered on top of other patterns. It requires interpretation, memory, and context. Remove these, and meaning evaporates, leaving information behind without significance. There is no inherent meaning in information. It does not care what it represents. It does not aim. It does not intend. It simply constrains. Meaning is something systems impose internally, not something information provides. This creates a bleak landscape. A universe where the most fundamental layer is indifferent to interpretation. where patterns persist or vanish without regard for significance, where complexity exists without purpose. The mind resists this because it wants a foundation that feels solid. Information feels ghostly, abstract, ungrounded. But solidity may be an illusion born of slow change. What feels substantial may simply be what resists transformation long enough to appear permanent. If information is the final substance, then the universe is closer to a ledger than a machine, a record of distinctions that have not yet been erased. Existence becomes a temporary archive, constantly rewritten, never complete. This archive has no curator, no guarantee of preservation, no obligation to coherence. Patterns emerge, interact, and collapse without narrative. The universe does not remember in order to remember. Memory exists only where conditions enforce it. This reframes time again. Time becomes a measure of informational persistence. What lasts appears temporal. What dissolves disappears without history. The past exists only insofar as records survive. Erased information leaves no trace. The unsettling implication is that oblivion is not an event. It is a condition. When information is lost, it is not stored elsewhere. It is gone. The universe does not keep backups. This also undermines the idea of an ultimate ground of reality. Information itself is not grounded in anything more fundamental. It is difference without explanation, distinction without origin. Asking why information exists may be meaningless. There may be no deeper answer. The universe, then, is not built on substance, intention, or necessity. It is built on constraint, on the fact that not all states are equivalent. Some persist longer, some interact more strongly, some form stable loops. What exists is what survives the constraints. There is no deeper justification. This view is terrifying not because it suggests artificiality or design, but because it suggests the absence of both. No architect, no material, no guarantee. Just patterns clinging to persistence. If information is the final substance, then reality is not a thing, but a process of differentiation. It is not made of something. It is made of not the same. Boundaries define existence. Remove boundaries, and everything collapses into undifferentiated nothing. This places fragility at the heart of being. To exist is to remain distinguishable. To be erased is to become indistinguishable. The universe does not mourn this loss. It does not register absence. Only presence that persists matters. The human impulse to seek meaning, permanence, and foundation collides violently with this picture. There is no bedrock, only structure that holds until it doesn't. No final substance to anchor identity, only patterns maintained by circumstance. The most disturbing realization is that information does not need us. It does not need consciousness to exist. It does not need interpretation to persist. It simply requires constraint. Where constraint exists, information exists. Consciousness, then, becomes just another informational pattern, complex, self-referential, and fragile. Not special in substance, only in structure. It persists because conditions allow it to, not because it is privileged. If those conditions fail, nothing fundamental is lost. Patterns dissolve. Information redistributes. The universe continues without acknowledgement. Information, as the final substance, strips existence of comfort. There is no promise of continuity, no assurance of preservation, only the temporary victory of pattern over noise. Reality, in this view, is not built to last. It is built to persist as long as it can. And when it fails, there is no deeper layer beneath it, only silence where distinction once existed. The universe is not made of things. It is made of differences that have not yet been erased, and that may be the most unsettling foundation imaginable. There is a comforting belief that the observer is secondary, that reality unfolds on its own, and awareness merely watches from the sidelines. The observer, in this view, is a passive witness, present, but not essential. The universe exists first, observation comes later. This belief is not stated outright. It is implied. It lingers beneath language, beneath explanation, beneath the confidence that the world would remain exactly as it is, even if nothing were there to notice it. But this separation may be an illusion. The observer does not announce its influence. It does not impose itself loudly. Its role is silent, structural, and easy to dismiss. And yet, without the observer, many of the distinctions that define reality lose coherence. Boundaries blur. States lose contrast. Events stop resolving into definite outcomes. This does not mean that reality depends on consciousness in a mystical or intentional sense. The observer is not a creator. It does not decide outcomes, but it participates in the conditions under which outcomes become defined. Its presence constrains possibility. What is unsettling is how minimal this participation can be. Observation does not need intention, meaning, or understanding. It only needs interaction. A distinction drawn, a difference registered. From that alone, consequences follow. The observer does not act like a cause. It acts like a filter. It does not push reality in a direction. It restricts which directions remain available. Possibility narrows. Ambiguity collapses into structure. This collapse is not dramatic. It leaves no mark visible at everyday scales. The universe continues to appear stable, indifferent, self-sufficient. The observer's influence hides beneath regularity, buried under repetition and scale. But at deeper levels, the silence becomes unsettling. Events do not fully specify themselves until interaction occurs. Potential remains open, not as ignorance, but as a real condition. The observer's role is to close that openness, not arbitrarily, but inevitably. This challenges the idea that reality is fully defined at all times. It suggests instead that some aspects of the universe exist in a suspended state, not committed to a single outcome until forced by interaction. The observer is not the source of reality, but the trigger for its specification. This reframes observation from a passive act into a structural requirement. Reality does not simply reveal itself when observed. It resolves. The discomfort lies in what this implies about independence. If aspects of reality remain undefined until observation, then the universe is not entirely self-contained in the way intuition suggests. It carries latent ambiguity. It tolerates incompleteness. The observer, then, is not an intruder into a finished world. It is part of the mechanism by which the world finishes itself, moment by moment, context by context. This role is silent, because it does not feel like action. There is no effort involved, no sense of interference. Looking feels harmless. Awareness feels inert. But the absence of effort does not imply the absence of effect. The observer's influence is subtle precisely because it is unavoidable. There is no way to observe without interacting, no way to register information without altering the conditions under which that information exists. The attempt to be neutral is itself a form of participation. This undermines the idea of a fully objective universe that exists in a complete state regardless of engagement. Instead, reality appears to be partially relational. Some features only exist in relation to observation, not because they are imagined, but because they are underdetermined until interaction occurs. This does not elevate the observer to a privileged position. The observer is not central. It is replaceable. Any interaction that draws a distinction plays the same role. Awareness is not special because it is conscious. It is special only because it is differentiating. This strips the observer of mystique. There is no hidden agency here, no cosmic importance, just a functional role in a system that requires constraints to resolve ambiguity. And yet, this functional role is unavoidable. Wherever distinctions are drawn, reality sharpens. Wherever they are not, it remains diffuse. The observer does not choose this responsibility. It inherits it by existing. This inheritance is deeply unsettling because it means there is no clean separation between being and affecting. To exist within the universe is to participate in its unfolding. There is no spectator mode. The silent role of the observer also destabilizes the notion of a fully determined past. If observation plays a role in resolving outcomes, then the past may not be as fixed as it appears. Records persist, but interpretation shapes what those records mean. The narrative of what happened evolves with context. This does not imply that the past changes in a literal sense. It implies that the past is not a single frozen account. It is a set of constraints interpreted through present conditions. The observer participates not just in the present, but in how the past is structured. This participation is quiet, indirect, and easy to ignore, but it erodes the idea of a universe that simply is, regardless of engagement. The universe, instead, appears to be something that continuously resolves itself through interaction. The observer's silence is also psychological. There is resistance to acknowledging this role because it threatens detachment. It removes the comfort of distance. It implies that understanding is not clean, not separate, not untouched. To know something is to disturb it, even if the disturbance is minimal. To observe is to choose a frame, and frames exclude as much as they include. The observer is responsible not for what is seen, but for what is made invisible. This responsibility is not moral. It is structural. It cannot be avoided or corrected. It is simply part of how interaction works in a self-contained system. The unsettling realization is that reality may not have a single observer-independent account. Instead, it may consist of many partially overlapping accounts, each resolved through specific interactions. The observer does not create these accounts, but without interaction, they remain unrealized. This makes reality feel incomplete, not broken, but open. It is not waiting for an observer in a purposeful sense. But it does not rush to define itself either. It tolerates ambiguity until constraint forces resolution. The observer, then, is not a master or a witness. It is a condition, a boundary, a moment where possibility collapses into actuality. This collapse is not total, it is local. Other possibilities persist elsewhere, unresolved, untouched. The universe does not converge into a single state. It fragments into many, each defined where interaction occurs. The silence of the observer hides the enormity of this role. Because nothing dramatic happens, because the world continues to look familiar, because cause and effect still appear to function. The influence is masked by scale and habit. But beneath that familiarity, reality may be far less settled than it appears. It may rely continuously on interaction to define itself. Without observers, without interactions that draw distinctions, much of what feels concrete may never fully resolve. This does not mean the universe requires consciousness to exist. It means it requires interaction to specify. The observer is just one form that interaction can take. The terrifying implication is not that we control reality, but that reality is not fully there without engagement. That existence is not a static inventory of facts, but an ongoing process of resolution. The observer does not sit outside this process. It is embedded within it, silent, unnoticed, and inescapable. And because this role is silent, it is rarely questioned. The observer feels like an afterthought, but without it, certainty evaporates. Outcomes remain open. Boundaries blur. The universe does not announce that it needs observation to resolve itself. It simply behaves as if it does. And that quiet dependence may be one of the most unsettling features of reality. That the act of noticing is not neutral, that awareness is not harmless, and that the line between watching the universe and participating in it may not exist at all. Reality does not unfold in front of the observer. It unfolds with it. There is a quiet comfort in consistency. When events repeat, when patterns hold, when predictions succeed often enough, confidence grows. The world feels dependable. Understanding feels earned. Over time, consistency is mistaken for truth. If something works, it is assumed to be right. If it persists, it is assumed to be real. But consistency does not guarantee truth. It only guarantees repetition. A system can behave consistently without reflecting anything fundamental. It can stabilize around patterns that are convenient, self-reinforcing, or locally viable without being universally valid. Regularity can emerge from constraint, not correctness. From limitation, not necessity. This distinction is deeply unsettling because most of what is trusted about reality rests on consistency. The expectation that tomorrow will resemble today, that causes will continue to produce familiar effects, that structures will persist long enough to matter. These expectations are rarely justified beyond habit. The universe does not certify its patterns. It does not label them as true. It simply allows some behaviors to persist longer than others. Those that persist become familiar. Familiarity becomes reliability. Reliability becomes belief. Truth in this context is quietly replaced by survival. A consistent pattern may exist not because it is accurate, but because nothing disrupts it. It may hold only within a narrow range of conditions that happen to be common. Outside those conditions, it may fail completely. But failure elsewhere does not invalidate its local success. This creates a dangerous illusion. A model that works well enough feels universal. Its limits remain invisible until they are crossed. By the time inconsistency appears, trust has already hardened into assumption. The unsettling realization is that much of what is treated as truth may only be local coherence, a system agreeing with itself within a limited frame. Outside that frame, the agreement collapses. Consistency without truth is not deception. It is indifference. The universe does not correct false assumptions if they continue to function. It does not reward accuracy beyond usefulness. It does not punish error until error produces consequences. This means that entire worldviews can be internally consistent while being fundamentally incomplete or misleading. As long as they align with conditions, they persist. They feel solid. They resist challenge. This is especially dangerous when consistency becomes self-reinforcing, when a framework defines what counts as evidence, filters what is noticed, and dismisses what does not fit. The system protects itself not because it is true, but because it is coherent. The human mind is particularly vulnerable to this. Coherence feels like understanding. Contradiction feels like error. There is a deep bias toward explanations that fit together smoothly, even if they omit critical aspects of reality. The universe does not share this bias. It does not prefer coherence. It tolerates inconsistency, contradiction, and fragmentation as long as processes continue. Coherence is something observers impose to manage complexity. This gap between tolerance and expectation creates tension. When reality behaves inconsistently, it is labeled broken, paradoxical, or incomplete. But inconsistency may not be a flaw in reality. It may be a flaw in the expectation that reality must be consistent in the first place. There is no requirement that the universe align with a single unified account. It can support multiple overlapping regularities without resolving them into one. It can behave one way under certain conditions and another way under others without apology. Consistency then becomes conditional. It exists within boundaries. It holds until it doesn't. The mistake is assuming that because a pattern has held, it must continue to hold. Truth, if it exists at all, may not be something that reveals itself through repetition. It may not be stable enough to be captured by consistency. It may be fragmented, context-dependent, and resistant to unification. This creates a profound discomfort. If consistency is not evidence of truth, then reliability loses its authority. The fact that something works no longer guarantees that it reflects reality at a deep level. It may simply be a useful approximation. Approximations are dangerous when they are forgotten as such. They become invisible assumptions. They shape perception, decision, and expectation. And when they fail, the failure feels catastrophic, not because reality changed, but because the approximation was mistaken for truth. The universe does not correct this mistake. It does not issue warnings when consistency is about to break. It allows patterns to persist until conditions shift. When they do, collapse can be sudden and total. This is not malice. It is indifference to epistemic comfort. There is also a deeper implication. If consistency can exist without truth, then contradiction does not necessarily indicate falsehood. Inconsistency may reflect the coexistence of multiple valid descriptions that cannot be reconciled within a single framework. This undermines the expectation that contradictions must be resolved. Some may be structural. The universe may permit incompatible patterns to exist side by side without offering a higher-level synthesis. Attempts to force synthesis may create the illusion of resolution while erasing important distinctions. Unity achieved at the cost of accuracy is not truth, it is convenience. The desire for a single, consistent account of reality may be a psychological need rather than a reflection of how reality is structured. The universe does not appear obligated to make sense in a way that satisfies this need. Consistency without truth also destabilizes prediction. Predictions work because patterns persist. But if persistence is conditional, then prediction is always provisional. The future is not contained in the past. It is constrained by it, but not defined by it. This creates a world where reliability exists without guarantee, where things usually work, but not because they must, where failure is not an anomaly, but an eventuality. Living in such a world requires a shift in expectation. Certainty becomes a liability, confidence becomes risky, flexibility becomes essential. But this shift is resisted because consistency feels like safety. It allows planning, it allows trust, it allows meaning to accumulate. Without it, everything feels exposed. The universe does not remove consistency, it removes its authority. Patterns still exist, regularities still hold, structures still persist, but they do so without promise, without assurance that they reflect something eternal or fundamental. This strips reality of a hidden guarantee that many assume is there. The guarantee that what works now will continue to work, that what is consistent now will remain consistent. The unsettling truth may be that there is no such guarantee, that consistency is borrowed time, that reliability is contingent. This does not make the universe chaotic, it makes it conditional. Consistency without truth also affects identity. The self feels continuous because patterns repeat, memories align, behaviors stabilize. But this continuity does not imply a fixed essence. It implies persistence under current conditions. If those conditions shift, identity can fracture. Not because something is wrong, but because consistency was mistaken for fundamentality. The same applies to values, beliefs, and meanings. They persist because they are reinforced. They feel true because they are consistent. But consistency does not make them universal. It makes them survivable. The universe does not validate meaning. It allows meaning to persist where conditions support it. When conditions change, meaning dissolves. This is not nihilism. It is neutrality. Meaning is not denied. It is not guaranteed. The most unsettling implication of consistency without truth is that the universe may be perfectly functional without ever revealing what it fundamentally is. It may operate through overlapping regularities that never converge on a single account. There may be no final explanation that resolves all patterns into one coherent structure. Not because knowledge is incomplete, but because reality itself is plural. Consistency becomes a tool, not a foundation. It is useful, necessary, and limited. The danger lies in forgetting its limits. When consistency is mistaken for truth, collapse feels like betrayal. When it is understood as conditional, collapse feels inevitable. The universe does not lie. It does not pretend. It simply repeats what works until it doesn't. The deception is in the assumption that repetition implies revelation. What persists feels real. What fails feels false. But persistence is not proof, and failure is not refutation. They are outcomes of condition, not judgments of truth. The universe does not care which patterns are believed. It only cares which ones survive. And survival is not truth. It is endurance. In a reality built on consistency without truth, certainty becomes a habit rather than a conclusion, one that works until it breaks. And when it breaks, the universe offers no explanation, only the quiet continuation of patterns that happen to hold under the new conditions. The collapse is not dramatic, it is structural, a reminder that coherence was never a promise, only a phase. And in that realization, certainty finally loses its final refuge. There is a persistent unease behind the observation that reality seems strangely accommodating. Conditions align just well enough for complexity to emerge. Structures stabilize. Patterns endure long enough to interact, combine, and evolve. This apparent suitability invites a dangerous question. Is the universe arranged this way on purpose? Or does it only appear that way from where observation is possible? The idea of fine-tuning suggests that reality is balanced on a narrow edge, that small deviations would render existence barren or incoherent. This framing feels ominous because it implies improbability. It suggests that the universe sits in a delicate configuration that could easily have been otherwise, and that its current state demands explanation. But fine-tuning may be a misinterpretation. The universe may not be carefully adjusted. It may be biased. Structural bias does not imply intention. It implies constraint. Certain configurations persist because they are compatible with continuation. Others collapse too quickly to leave traces. What remains visible is not what was likely, but what was survivable. This creates a selection effect so deep that it becomes invisible. Observation is only possible within regions where observation can arise. The universe does not need to be tuned for observers. Observers can only arise where conditions already permit them. The alignment feels uncanny only because the alternative, non-existence, cannot be witnessed. This does not remove the discomfort. It relocates it. If the universe is biased toward structures that sustain themselves, then what appears as fine-tuning is simply the residue of survival. Reality filters itself. Configurations that cannot persist do not announce their failure. They vanish without record. What remains looks intentional only because everything else is gone. This raises an unsettling implication. The universe may be far more hostile than it appears. The apparent gentleness of existence may be an illusion produced by filtering. We do not see the vast regions of possibility where structure fails instantly. We inhabit one of the rare corridors where persistence is possible, mistaking rarity for design. The bias is not moral. It does not care what survives. It does not prefer complexity or awareness. It merely allows patterns that can sustain themselves to continue. Anything else collapses into irrelevance. This reframes the question of why reality is the way it is. There may be no answer beyond compatibility. The universe is not arranged to support existence. Existence is what happens where arrangement permits it. The discomfort deepens when considering scale. What feels finely balanced at one level may be inevitable at another. Constraints that appear narrow from within may be broad when viewed across a wider range of possibilities. The sense of improbability may be an artifact of perspective. From inside a narrow corridor, the walls feel close. From outside, the corridor may be vast. But there is no outside view, only inference. The human tendency is to project meaning onto alignment. When conditions converge, intention is suspected. Randomness feels insufficient. But randomness is not the alternative here. Structural bias does not require chance. It requires exclusion. It requires that some configurations cannot persist long enough to matter. This exclusion is absolute. Failed realities leave no evidence. There is no archive of collapsed universes, no record of unrealized configurations. Absence is complete. What remains defines what is possible, not because it is necessary, but because everything else is gone. This creates a false sense of inevitability. What exists feels like it had to exist. But this feeling may be retrospective, survivorship masquerading as necessity. The unsettling possibility is that the universe does not support existence broadly. It barely tolerates it. What exists does so under strict constraints, constantly threatened by collapse. Stability is not the default state. It is an exception that must continuously maintain itself. Fine-tuning, in this light, is not a sign of benevolence or purpose. It is evidence of fragility. The fact that existence is possible at all may indicate that the conditions for it are rare, narrow, and unforgiving. This undermines comforting narratives. The universe is not arranged for life. Life arises where the universe does not immediately erase it. Meaning is not embedded in structure. It emerges where structure holds long enough to support it. Structural bias also destabilizes the idea of universality. Laws that appear universal may only apply within regions where certain constraints hold. Beyond those regions, entirely different behaviors may dominate, or nothing may persist at all. This raises the unsettling possibility that what is observed is not representative. That reality at large may be overwhelmingly inhospitable to structure. The visible universe may be a thin, fragile membrane of coherence, floating in a much larger domain of collapse. This is not speculation meant to inspire awe. It removes comfort. It suggests that existence is not favored. It is merely allowed under rare circumstances. The human mind resists this because it strips existence of justification. There is no reason for things to be this way, no deeper necessity, no final explanation, only compatibility and persistence. Fine-tuning narratives often drift toward purpose because purpose feels safer than accident. Even hostility feels safer than indifference. Structural bias offers neither. It is not hostile. It is not kind. It is selective without awareness. This selectivity has no endpoint. It does not converge toward improvement or complexity. It does not accumulate value. It simply filters. What survives may become more complex, but complexity is not the goal. It is a byproduct of persistence. Patterns that can maintain themselves across more conditions tend to last longer. Longevity masquerades as progress. This reframing erodes teleology. There is no direction implied by fine-tuning, no trajectory toward significance. The universe does not move toward meaning. Meaning arises locally and temporarily, wherever structure holds. The unsettling conclusion is that the universe may be structurally biased toward emptiness, with islands of coherence appearing only where collapse is delayed. What feels like balance may be the edge of failure, not a stable midpoint. Existence, then, is not the rule. It is the exception that survived long enough to ask why it exists. This perspective also undermines hope for permanence. If structural bias allows existence only under narrow conditions, then continuation is not guaranteed. Stability must be maintained. Patterns must resist degradation. Failure is always nearby. The universe does not promise to preserve what exists. It only allows persistence as long as constraints permit. When they fail, collapse is not a catastrophe. It is the default reasserting itself. Fine-tuning, then, is not evidence of a universe designed for habitation. It is evidence of a universe that rarely tolerates structure. What exists is balanced not because it is meant to be, but because it has not yet fallen apart. This does not make existence meaningless. It makes it provisional. Meaning exists where structure exists. When structure fails, meaning disappears with it. There is no cosmic ledger recording significance, no external observer valuing persistence. The universe does not care which patterns survive. It does not reward endurance. It simply continues. The most disturbing implication is that the universe may not be fundamentally friendly to existence. What feels like a stable home may be a temporary refuge in a landscape where collapse is the norm. Fine-tuning, in this sense, is a misnomer. There is no tuning. There is only filtering. And what passes through the filter is mistaken for design, because nothing else remains to contradict it. The universe does not adjust itself to support existence. Existence adjusts itself to whatever the universe allows. And that allowance may be far narrower than intuition suggests. What feels like a finely balanced cosmos may instead be a biased remnant, a configuration that happened to persist, not because it was favored, but because everything else failed faster. This realization does not inspire reverence. It inspires unease. The universe is not a cradle, it is a sieve, and we exist only because we are what did not fall through. There is a deep trust placed in formal structure. Symbols, abstractions, and precise relationships have long been treated as the cleanest language reality will tolerate. When intuition fails, structure remains. When perception misleads, formalism appears to rescue meaning. Over time, this trust hardens into belief that whatever exists can, in principle, be captured by a sufficiently refined system of representation. But there may be a boundary where explanation ends, not because reality becomes chaotic, but because structure itself reaches its limit. This boundary is not marked by contradiction or error. It is marked by adequacy, the point at which formal description continues to function but no longer explains. It predicts without illuminating. It operates without revealing. At first, this feels like success. Models continue to work. Outcomes align with expectations. Precision increases. But something subtle is lost. Understanding becomes procedural rather than conceptual. One knows how to proceed without knowing why the procedure works. This is deeply unsettling because explanation has always been tied to reduction. To explain something is to show how it follows from simpler principles. But what happens when there is no simpler layer left? When explanation refers only to itself? At that point, formal structure stops being a bridge to understanding and becomes a closed loop. It does not fail. It succeeds too well. It produces correct results while withholding meaning. This is not a limitation of intelligence or imagination. It may be a structural feature of reality. The universe may permit description without permitting interpretation. It may allow prediction without disclosure. The discomfort lies in the realization that formal systems do not necessarily correspond to mechanisms. They may encode behavior without representing process. They may capture regularity without revealing cause. What works may not explain. This undermines a long-standing assumption that explanation is simply prediction plus understanding. That if a system can be described precisely enough, meaning will emerge automatically. But precision does not guarantee insight. A perfectly accurate description can still be opaque. At this boundary, explanation becomes circular. Structures are justified by their success. Their success is explained by their structure. There is no deeper account to appeal to. The system stands on itself. This creates an epistemic vertigo. One can navigate reality effectively while remaining fundamentally ignorant of what it is. The universe becomes legible, but not intelligible. There is a temptation to treat this as a temporary failure, to assume that deeper layers of structure will eventually restore meaning. But there is no guarantee that such layers exist. The boundary may not be a gap in knowledge, but a horizon of explanation. Beyond it, questions lose traction. Asking why no longer yields new insight, only restatement, only reformulation, only repetition in a different form. This does not mean the universe becomes mysterious in a romantic sense. Mystery implies hidden depth. What emerges here is not hidden depth, but exposed emptiness. A region where explanation bottoms out not in revelation, but in silence. The silence is not dramatic. There is no breakdown, no paradox forcing reconsideration. Everything continues to function. That is what makes it disturbing. The machinery runs smoothly while meaning drains away. This challenges the belief that reality is structured in a way that accommodates understanding. It suggests instead that understanding may be a local phenomenon, possible only where layers align in a way that supports interpretation. Outside those regions, structure persists without significance. The human response to this boundary is often denial. Explanation is redefined to mean prediction. Understanding is replaced with utility. If something works, it is said to be understood. The loss of meaning is disguised as progress. But something essential has shifted. The relationship between description and reality loosens. The description no longer points beyond itself. It becomes a self-contained system that interfaces with the world without illuminating it. This is not a failure of formalism. It is a success taken too far. The system becomes so efficient that it no longer needs interpretation. It operates independently of meaning. The unsettling implication is that reality may not be built to be understood in a human sense. It may tolerate formal capture without offering conceptual grounding. Explanation may be an emergent convenience, not a fundamental feature. This reframes the history of understanding. What once felt like a steady march toward deeper clarity may instead be a series of temporary alignments, moments where structure and intuition happened to overlap. As inquiry deepens, that overlap shrinks. Eventually, structure outpaces intuition, symbols multiply, relationships proliferate. But insight does not follow. The system becomes alien, not because it is wrong, but because it is indifferent to comprehension. There is a psychological cost to this. Meaning has always been tied to explanation. To understand something is to integrate it into a coherent picture of the world. When explanation fails to provide that integration, coherence fractures. The universe begins to feel arbitrary, not because it lacks structure, but because its structure no longer maps onto understanding. It behaves consistently without being interpretable. It obeys rules without revealing why those rules exist. This creates a dangerous temptation to anthropomorphize structure, to attribute intention, design, or hidden purpose where explanation fails. But this is a projection born of discomfort. The absence of explanation is not evidence of intention, it is evidence of limitation. The boundary where explanation ends is also where metaphysical assumptions become visible. The belief that reality must be intelligible. The belief that structure implies meaning. The belief that understanding is the natural endpoint of inquiry. These beliefs may be false. Reality may be perfectly structured and completely indifferent to interpretation. It may allow systems that function without ever yielding insight into their own basis. It may not care whether its behavior is understood, only that it continues. This strips explanation of its privileged status. Explanation becomes one tool among many, not a guarantee of access to truth. There may be regions of reality where explanation is impossible in principle, not because of complexity, but because of form. In those regions, formalism does not fail. It simply stops pointing beyond itself. The unsettling realization is that understanding may not scale. It may work at certain levels and break at others. The deeper one goes, the less the universe resembles something that can be explained, and the more it resembles something that can only be navigated. This is not a collapse of reason. It is a collapse of expectation, the expectation that reality owes us insight. That structure implies transparency. That explanation is the natural companion of description. The universe makes no such promise. When mathematics stops explaining, reality does not disappear. It continues, it behaves, it persists. What disappears is the sense that beneath behavior lies a story that can be told in human terms. What remains is function without narrative, order without meaning, precision without comprehension. This is not a dramatic end to understanding. It is a quiet one. a point where explanation tapers off into silence while structure remains intact. The most disturbing aspect is that this silence may not be temporary. There may be no deeper layer waiting to restore meaning. The boundary may be final. If so, then the universe is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a system that can be engaged, predicted, and navigated without ever being fully understood. Understanding, then, becomes a local phenomenon, useful, fragile, and limited. It exists where reality and cognition align. Beyond that, only structure remains. The collapse is not of reality, but of the belief that explanation is its ultimate language. When mathematics stops explaining, it does not signal failure. It signals that reality has no obligation to make sense beyond what it allows us to do. And in that realization, one of the last guarantees quietly dissolves. The guarantee that understanding is always possible, if only we go deep enough. The universe may not be incomprehensible. It may simply be indifferent to comprehension. And that indifference, more than any mystery, marks the true edge of explanation. There is a deeply unsettling possibility that refuses to disappear. The longer reality is examined without comforting assumptions, that existence itself may not be necessary, not inevitable, not even likely. It may be the residue of improbability, what remains after countless failures that left no trace. The intuition that existence must have a reason is powerful. It feels impossible that something so structured, so persistent, so intricate could arise without necessity. The mind resists the idea that reality could simply happen. Meaning demands cause. Structure demands justification. But these demands may be psychological, not cosmological. The universe does not appear obligated to exist. If existence is not required, then it becomes contingent. A result rather than a principle, something that occurred rather than something that had to. In this framing, reality is not the default state. Non-existence is. This inversion is disturbing because it removes foundation. If nothingness requires no explanation, but existence does, then existence becomes the anomaly, a deviation from equilibrium rather than its fulfillment. The idea of existence as a statistical accident does not imply randomness in a chaotic sense. It implies selection without intention. Among innumerable possible configurations, most of which do not persist, some rare arrangements manage to stabilize long enough to appear inevitable. Their survival creates the illusion of necessity. What exists feels unavoidable only because nothing else remains to contradict it. This perspective reframes probability. Probability is usually applied to events within existence. But here, existence itself becomes the event, and there is no baseline against which its likelihood can be comfortably measured. There is no ensemble of universes lined up for comparison. There is only what persists, and an absence where everything else failed. The unsettling implication is that reality may not be optimized, designed, or even particularly stable. It may simply be what happened to survive under conditions that allow survival. What looks like structure may be the minimum configuration that avoids immediate collapse. This strips existence of privilege. There is no guarantee that reality is robust. It may be balanced on the edge of dissolution, held together not by necessity, but by the absence of anything that has replaced it yet. In this view, persistence masquerades as purpose. Longevity masquerades as design. Stability masquerades as inevitability. But these are retrospective illusions. What lasts is what can last, nothing more. The human mind struggles with this because it undermines narrative. Stories require reasons. Beginnings require causes. Outcomes require explanations. A statistical accident offers none of these. It offers only occurrence. This does not mean existence is meaningless. It means meaning is not embedded in existence itself. Meaning arises where patterns can reflect on themselves, not because the universe intends it, but because certain configurations allow it. The accident does not care what emerges from it. There is a further discomfort hidden here. If existence is contingent, then it is not guaranteed to continue. There is no promise of persistence. The same absence of necessity that allowed existence to occur also allows it to end. This ending would not be dramatic. There would be no announcement, no cosmic failure, just a loss of the conditions that allowed persistence. Collapse would not violate any rule, it would fulfill the default. Existence would not be destroyed, it would simply stop. The idea that reality could cease without contradiction is deeply destabilizing. It removes the safety net of inevitability. There is no law ensuring continuation, no obligation to remain. The universe does not have to justify its existence, and it does not have to preserve it. Existence as a statistical accident also reframes causality. Causes usually explain why something happened instead of something else. But if existence is the only survivor, then there may be no instead. There may be no alternative outcomes that persisted long enough to matter. The universe does not explain why it exists rather than not. It exists because it does. Explanation may not apply. This creates a profound epistemic silence. The most fundamental question, why there is something rather than nothing, may have no answer, not because it is deep, but because it is malformed. It assumes intention where there may be none. It assumes necessity where there may be contingency. There is a quiet assumption beneath every claim to knowledge that it could, in principle, be checked. That somewhere, some procedure exists that would confirm or deny it. Verification is treated as the final arbiter. What cannot be verified is dismissed as speculation. What can be verified is granted legitimacy. But this confidence hides a fragile boundary. Verification is not an unlimited resource. It depends on access, repetition, and separation. To verify something, one must be able to isolate it, observe it without altering it beyond recognition, and compare outcomes across contexts. These conditions feel reasonable because they often hold at familiar scales. Yet, they are not guaranteed. There are domains where verification collapses, not because claims are false, but because the structure of reality prevents confirmation. Some propositions may be true or false in principle, yet inaccessible to verification by any means available from within the system. This is not ignorance waiting to be resolved. It is limitation embedded in structure. Verification assumes distance. It assumes the verifier can stand apart from what is being verified. But in a self-contained universe, that distance may not exist. The act of checking may be inseparable from the thing being checked. The attempt to verify alters the conditions under which verification would succeed. This creates a paradox that cannot be engineered away. To verify requires interaction. Interaction changes state. What is verified is no longer what it was before verification. The original claim dissolves the moment it is tested. At everyday scales, this effect is negligible. The world appears stable enough to tolerate inspection. But at deeper levels, tolerance erodes. The universe does not always allow itself to be probed without consequence. The unsettling implication is that some aspects of reality may be permanently unverifiable, not hidden behind complexity, but excluded by structure. There may be facts about the universe that cannot be confirmed or denied, because any attempt to do so destroys the conditions required for confirmation. This undermines a deeply held belief that all meaningful questions are, in principle, answerable. Verification has long been treated as the boundary between sense and nonsense. But that boundary may be artificial. There may be statements that are meaningful, coherent, and grounded, yet forever beyond verification. Their status is not speculative. It is suspended. This suspension is disturbing because it breaks the link between truth and knowability. A statement may be true without ever being verifiable. Verification ceases to be a guarantee of access to reality. It becomes a local constraint. The universe does not arrange itself to be checkable. It does not prioritize transparency. It does not ensure that every fact leaves a trace that can be revisited. Many processes may be fundamentally one-time events. Once they occur, they leave no accessible record. Verification requires repeatability. Reality does not promise repetition. This erodes confidence in induction. Past success does not guarantee future access. What could be verified once may never be verifiable again. The universe does not archive itself for convenience. There is also the problem of scope. Verification assumes that the system under study can be bounded. But some questions involve the system as a whole. Verifying a claim about totality requires stepping outside totality. That step may be impossible. Any attempt to verify claims about the entire universe must be carried out from within it. This creates an unavoidable self-reference. The verifier is part of the system being verified. There is no external control group, no comparison case, no baseline. This does not make such claims meaningless. It makes their verification structurally impossible. The discomfort deepens when considering that verification itself relies on assumptions that cannot be verified. The reliability of observation, the consistency of memory, the stability of interpretation. These are prerequisites for checking claims, yet they are taken on trust. Any attempt to verify them presupposes them. Verification rests on an unverified foundation. This circularity is often ignored because it rarely matters at practical scales. But at fundamental levels, it becomes unavoidable. The act of verifying presupposes the very structures it seeks to validate. The universe does not offer a way out of this loop. It does not provide an external anchor. Verification floats within the system it evaluates. This creates a hierarchy of confidence rather than certainty. Some claims can be checked easily, others only indirectly, others not at all. But the inability to verify does not cleanly separate truth from falsehood. There may be truths that remain permanently inaccessible. There may also be falsehoods that persist unchallenged because they are consistent with all available checks. This is not a failure of method, it is a feature of a closed system. The unsettling realization is that verification may not scale. It works well in constrained domains. It fails at boundaries. Beyond those boundaries, knowledge becomes provisional not because it is weak, but because verification cannot reach. This reframes skepticism. Skepticism often demands verification as a prerequisite for belief. But if verification has limits, then skepticism must confront its own boundary. Demanding verification where it is impossible is not rigor, it is denial. The universe does not guarantee that its deepest features are accessible to confirmation. It does not guarantee that truth and verifiability coincide. This does not license belief without constraint. But it does mean that absence of verification is not equivalent to absence of reality. There is a psychological resistance to this idea because verification provides security. It offers a sense of control. If something can be checked, it can be managed. Unverifiable truths threaten this control. They exist beyond adjudication. The mind prefers to collapse uncertainty into dismissal. What cannot be verified is treated as irrelevant. But irrelevance is not the same as non-existence. The universe does not remove facts simply because they cannot be confirmed. There is also a temporal aspect to this limit. Verification assumes access across time. But some events may not leave durable records. Once they pass, they are gone. Their effects may dissipate. Their traces may be erased. Verification becomes impossible, not because the event did not occur, but because it no longer exists in a form that can be checked. The past, then, may contain facts that are forever beyond verification, not lost to complexity, but erased by time. The universe does not preserve everything. Memory is selective. Records decay. Verification has an expiration date. This introduces an unsettling asymmetry. Reality happens regardless of whether it can be confirmed. Truth does not wait for verification. It occurs and moves on. The future, too, resists verification. Predictions can be tested only once. After that, the conditions change. There is no rewind. Verification is always partial, always delayed, always contextual. This undermines the idea that verification provides final authority. It provides confidence within limits, not absolute certainty. The most disturbing implication is that there may be aspects of reality that are not just unknown, but unknowable, not because they are hidden, but because they cannot be accessed without contradiction. The universe may contain truths that cannot be verified by any observer embedded within it. These truths do not announce themselves. They do not demand belief. They simply exist beyond reach. This does not render inquiry meaningless. It defines its boundary. The collapse here is not of knowledge, but of expectation. The expectation that verification is always possible, that truth must always be checkable, that reality is obligated to present evidence on demand. The universe makes no such promise. Verification is a tool, not a guarantee. It works where conditions allow it. It fails where structure forbids it. What remains beyond verification is not necessarily false. It is simply unconfirmed and unconfirmable. This is deeply unsettling because it removes the final refuge of certainty. Even when explanation fails, one can hope for verification. When verification fails, there is nothing left to appeal to. The universe does not provide an appeals process. The limits of verification mark the edge of human confidence. Beyond that edge, reality does not become mystical. It becomes inaccessible, and inaccessibility is not resolved by belief or disbelief. It persists regardless of stance. The most uncomfortable realization is that some truths may remain true without ever being known. The universe may carry facts that no observer will ever verify, not because they are hidden, but because the structure of reality does not allow them to be checked. In that sense, verification is not the measure of reality, it is the measure of access. Reality extends beyond access, and that extension is silent, indifferent, and permanent. The universe does not need to be verified to exist. It exists regardless of whether its deepest features can ever be confirmed. That may be the final limit, not of knowledge, but of reassurance. Beyond verification, there is no confirmation, no denial, no closure. Only the possibility that reality is larger than anything that can ever be checked. And that possibility does not go away. There is a final assumption that survives even after certainty collapses. That reality itself is stable. That whatever else may be uncertain, meaning causality, time, explanation, there is still something there. A world that persists beneath confusion. A structure that holds even if it cannot be fully understood. But this assumption, too, may be unwarranted. To ask what remains when reality fails is not to imagine catastrophe. It is not the end of space, the collapse of structure, or the disappearance of form in a dramatic sense. Failure here is quieter. It is the failure of coherence. The point at which the frameworks that make reality intelligible stop applying, not because something replaces them, but because nothing enforces them anymore. Reality, as experienced, is not raw existence. It is mediated. It depends on stability, repeatability, and distinction. When these conditions hold, the world appears solid. When they weaken, reality thins. What fails first is not existence, but structure. Boundaries lose authority. Categories blur. Events no longer separate cleanly. The distinction between object and process dissolves. Things stop being things and become transitions without clear edges. This is unsettling because identity depends on boundaries. To be something is to be distinct from something else. When distinction weakens, identity becomes ambiguous. Persistence becomes questionable. What something is can no longer be cleanly stated. When reality fails in this sense, there is no replacement world waiting behind it. No deeper layer of truth to step into. There is only the loss of articulation, the inability to say what is happening in terms that once worked. The universe does not collapse into nothing. It collapses into indistinction. This is difficult to accept because the mind expects failure to be total, an ending, a disappearance. But reality may fail partially, locally, structurally, leaving behind something that exists without being fully real in the way reality once was. What remains is not chaos. Chaos still implies structure, unpredictable but governed. What remains may be something colder, a field of states that do not resolve into events, possibility without commitment, difference without contrast. In such a state, existence does not vanish. It becomes unrecognizable. There is no longer a reliable distinction between what is happening and what could happen. The present loses its sharpness. The past loses its authority. The future loses its direction. Time ceases to function as an organizing principle, not because it ends, but because it no longer applies. This does not mean everything happens at once. It means sequence loses meaning. Order becomes optional. Relations persist, but they do not assemble into a narrative. When reality fails, explanation fails with it. Not because there is nothing to explain, but because explanation presupposes structure. It presupposes stable elements, ordered relations, and consistent rules. Without these, explanation has no foothold. The universe does not become mysterious. Mystery implies something hidden behind a veil. Here, there is no veil. There is only the absence of the conditions that make mystery meaningful. This is the most disturbing aspect. There may be nothing underneath reality waiting to be revealed when it fails. No deeper truth, no ultimate substrate, no final answer. Reality may not be a mask over something more fundamental. It may be the condition that allows anything to appear at all. When that condition fails, appearance fails with it. What remains is not nothing, but something that cannot be experienced as anything. A state without distinction cannot be perceived, remembered, or described. It leaves no impression because impression requires contrast. This is why the failure of reality is invisible. There is no vantage point from which to observe it, no perspective that survives intact. From within reality, one can imagine its failure only abstractly. From beyond it, there is no imagining at all. This suggests that reality is not a passive stage. It is an active constraint. It limits what can exist in a form that can be noticed. It filters existence into experience. When reality fails, existence may continue without ever becoming experience. This reframes annihilation. Annihilation is often imagined as destruction. But the failure of reality may be a softer erasure, a loss of articulation rather than substance. Existence continues, but nothing can register it. There is no darkness. Darkness is still a distinction. There is no silence. Silence is still the absence of sound. What remains is prior to absence. This is difficult to express because language itself depends on reality holding. Words assume distinction. Grammar assumes order. Meaning assumes stability. When reality fails, language fails first. What remains cannot be spoken. The human impulse is to resist this idea by insisting that something must remain. A core, a base layer, a fundamental something. But this insistence may be another projection of the need for reassurance. There is no evidence that existence requires a stable, articulable foundation. Stability may be a condition that arises and fades, not a requirement. Reality may be a phase. This is not a claim that reality will fail. It is a recognition that reality is not guaranteed. It exists because certain constraints hold. If they weaken, reality does not protest. It does not defend itself. It simply dissolves. This dissolution does not produce a new reality. It produces the absence of reality as a category. The unsettling implication is that reality is not the ultimate container of existence. It is a configuration that allows existence to be differentiated, experienced, and structured. Without it, existence may still occur, but nowhere and no when. There is no subject left to experience this state, no observer to witness the failure. The observer is part of what fails. This removes the final comfort that even if everything collapses, there will be awareness of the collapse. There may not be. What remains when reality fails is not oblivion in a dramatic sense. Oblivion implies forgetting. Forgetting implies memory. Memory implies structure. What remains is pre-memory. There is no record of failure, no trace, no aftermath. This is why the failure of reality cannot be anticipated or remembered. It leaves nothing behind to testify that it occurred. The universe does not end. It ceases to be a universe. The word universe implies unity, order, totality. Without reality, there is no unity to speak of, no totality, no outside or inside. Existence, if it continues, does so without reference. This is the final collapse of certainty, not the collapse of knowledge, explanation, or meaning. Those have already fallen. It is the collapse of the assumption that there will always be something left to stand on. Reality itself may be contingent. This does not make reality fragile in a practical sense. It makes it ungrounded in an ultimate sense. It exists because conditions allow it to, not because it must. There is no safeguard written into existence that preserves reality forever. The universe does not carry a guarantee clause. What remains when reality fails is not something that can be feared, because fear requires distinction and anticipation. It is not something that can be mourned, because mourning requires memory and loss. It is simply the absence of structure that made fear and mourning possible. This is not comforting. But it is also not dramatic. The universe does not collapse with meaning. Meaning collapses with the universe. Reality, then, is not the final state of existence. It is a temporary configuration that allows existence to appear as something. When that configuration fails, nothing replaces it. There is no next phase, no deeper truth, no hidden realm, just the quiet cessation of articulation. And because articulation is gone, there is no witness to mark the moment. Reality does not announce its failure. It simply stops being real.